Mark Teller thought he was searching for a missing camper. Didn't know he was walking straight into the hunting ground of a serial killer who had already written his name on the next-to-die list. Officer Mark Teller was no stranger to the wild. After 20 years in law enforcement, most of it spent patrolling the remote northern edges of Montana, he had seen his share of strange disappearances. But something about the call he received one chilly September morning unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. A man named Ryan Caldwell had vanished during a solo camping trip in the Bitterroot Wilderness. According to Ryan's sister, he was punctual and always checked in. He had mapped his route carefully and planned to return after 3 nights. 5 days had passed. There was still no word. Mark packed light and set out in his 4-wheeler, following the GPS coordinates shared by the family. The air was crisp, the leaves just starting to change, and the forest was quiet in a way that made every step echo. He parked at the trailhead and began his hike into the deeper woods. The early hours were uneventful. He passed campsites left abandoned for the season and followed a stream that Ryan was said to have planned as his water source. Everything looked normal at first, until it didn't. Near the base of a ridgeline, Mark noticed something odd. A tangle of branches looked like it had been arranged, not fallen naturally. Curious, he stepped off the trail. Just a few feet in, partially buried under dried pine needles, he found a dark green backpack. It was torn, with claw-like rips across the back. The zipper was open. Clothes, a small flashlight, and a notebook were scattered around it, almost as if someone had been searching through it in a hurry. The most alarming detail was a dark stain on the shoulder strap. It was dried blood. The contents of the notebook offered no explanation, just a few lists, meals, supplies, hiking plans. But the final page was scribbled with what looked like unfinished words and shaky handwriting. Mark's instincts sharpened. Something had gone very wrong. There were no signs of a struggle, but the area felt wrong, too still. He tried calling in, but his radio buzzed with static. His phone had no reception. Still, he documented the scene with photos and decided to press farther before turning back. Maybe Ryan had injured himself and wandered in search of help. Maybe someone else had come upon his camp. Every explanation felt incomplete. Less than 100 yards beyond the backpack, the forest changed. The path narrowed, and the trees grew closer together, creating a tunnel of branches that let in very little light. It didn't appear on his map. It looked like an old animal trail, but the brush had been cut just enough to allow passage. Mark paused. There was no wind, no birds, no rustling of wildlife, just silence. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a warning. Still, he moved forward, unaware that each step took him closer, not to a lost hiker, but something far more sinister waiting beyond the trees. The trail that Officer Mark Teller followed grew stranger the farther he went. It was narrow, winding, and barely visible to the untrained eye. It snaked between tightly packed trees, the branches above weaving a dense canopy that swallowed daylight. The deeper he ventured, the more unnatural the silence became. The forest had always been quiet in this region, but this was something else. Like the woods themselves were holding their breath. His boots crunched softly over a thin layer of decaying leaves, yet the sound barely echoed. Even the usual insect buzz was gone. Everything felt frozen in time. He kept his hand close to his sidearm, not out of fear, but instinct. Something was off. He had walked through hundreds of forest trails in his career, but this one felt constructed, hidden deliberately. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was designed to keep people out, or perhaps trap those who wandered in. After nearly a half hour of slow, calculated movement, he spotted something up ahead. It was a man-made structure, barely visible beneath layers of branches and leaves. As he got closer, it became clear that it was a shelter, built from logs, tarps, and camouflaging netting. Whoever had built it knew how to stay hidden. The construction was deliberate, methodical, and too sophisticated to be temporary. Mark moved cautiously, circling around to avoid disturbing anything. His eyes scanned the perimeter for movement. There was none. Inside, the space was cramped and dark. There were canned goods stacked neatly in one corner and wrappers from energy bars, some still relatively fresh. A pair of boots sat near a rolled-up sleeping bag, but what drew Mark's attention immediately was the wall. Nailed to the wood were 7 driver's licenses, all of them aged, some faded from sun or moisture. He recognized one. It belonged to Ryan Caldwell. Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. This was no random shelter. This was someone's hidden base, someone who had possibly been collecting victims. And if Ryan's ID was here, the worst was likely true. Mark took photos of everything. As he turned to leave, something near the edge of the shelter caught his eye. A half-buried object sticking out of the dirt. He knelt down and brushed away the soil. A human jawbone stared back at him. He didn't need forensic analysis to know it was real. More digging revealed fragments of ribs, a vertebra, and part of a skull. Mark stood up, his stomach twisting. This wasn't just a disappearance. This was a kill site. His radio still gave nothing but static. With no way to call it in, he knew he had to get back and report it in person. He marked the trees with bright orange tape on his way out, hoping it would help him or anyone else find the shelter again. But as he turned back toward the trail, the breeze shifted. There were no birds, no squirrels, just the faint crunch of leaves behind him. He froze. He was no longer alone. Mark Teller didn't turn around immediately. Years of experience taught him the danger of sudden movements in the unknown. Instead, he stood still and listened, heart pounding in his ears, trying to separate natural forest sounds from what he thought he'd heard. The leaves had definitely shifted. Not from wind, there wasn't any, but from something heavier. He slowly started walking, pretending not to notice, placing each foot down quietly while his senses remained on high alert. The forest around him had changed. What had been a hidden trail earlier now felt like a tunnel, narrower, darker, and unfamiliar. Mark looked for the orange tape he had used to mark his path, but it was gone. Every tree looked the same. The trail seemed to twist in ways it hadn't before. He began to suspect he was being redirected, guided away from the shelter. He paused to get his bearings and caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Not an animal, not a bird, a figure. Still. Watching from a distance, partially concealed behind a thick pine. Whoever it was made no attempt to approach or flee. They just watched. Mark didn't call out. He simply started moving again, this time choosing a more direct path, determined to reach higher ground where he might get a signal. As he hiked upward, the terrain became more rugged. Loose rocks and roots slowed him down. He felt exposed, like something was observing him from above. He reached a clearing with a flat rock surface and turned to scan the area behind him. For a moment, everything was still. But then, high up in the branches of a spruce tree, he spotted it again. A figure, this time perched on a thick limb, motionless. It wore a hood or some kind of mask. Mark couldn't make out a face. Just the outline of a body crouched in silence as if it had been there for hours. The sight chilled him to the core. He had spent his career confronting criminals, but this was different. This person wasn't afraid of being caught. They were tracking him like prey. He turned away, forcing himself not to run, not to let panic cloud his judgment. He needed to stay sharp, alert, and above all, calm. As he descended the other side of the ridge, Mark found a dry creek bed and followed it. He reasoned it would eventually lead to lower elevation and possibly back to familiar ground. But even there, he noticed things that didn't belong. Snapped branches at shoulder height, animal bones placed in strange piles, and scratch marks on tree trunks that looked too wide to be natural. Hours passed. The sun began to fade behind the trees. Mark's phone remained dead. The feeling of being hunted never left. He didn't know who the figure in the trees was, or how long they'd been out there. But one thing was clear. They knew the forest better than he ever could, and they were making sure he never left it the same. By the time Mark finally reached a familiar trail junction, the sky had darkened into a deep shade of blue. The temperature dropped sharply, and the silence of the forest took on a new weight, one that pressed against his chest with invisible hands. His muscles ached from the climb, his throat dry, his eyes constantly darting. Every snapped twig or rustle of a branch made him pause, listening for footsteps that never fully revealed themselves. He felt like a trespasser, not just in territory, but in something far more dangerous, something orchestrated. He had no doubt now that he was being followed, but not in a clumsy, reckless way. Whoever was behind this knew how to blend with the woods, how to move without sound. They wanted him to know he wasn't alone, yet remain always just out of reach. The psychological pressure was relentless. Mark knew that if he let his fear take over, he might make a mistake, and in this kind of place, even a small mistake could mean vanishing forever. At last, a small rise in elevation brought him within range of a signal. His phone buzzed to life for the first time in hours. The battery was low, but he immediately sent his coordinates to dispatch and marked his location with a red flare. Then, just as he lowered the phone, he noticed something unusual near the base of a nearby tree, a wooden box half covered in moss and dirt. It didn't look recent. The wood was weathered and stained. Mark hesitated only briefly before opening it. Inside were objects wrapped in wax paper. When he peeled back the layers, what he found made his stomach twist. Photographs. Dozens of them. Some were black and white, others color. All appeared to be taken in the forest. Most showed individuals, men, women, even children, posing at campsites or hiking trails, smiling. Then the photos became darker, images of the same people bound, hurt, lifeless. There were journal pages, too. Each described a target, their habits, and their final moments. The writing was small, controlled, eerily calm.